Hey Code Crew, so I'm getting pretty serious with SwiftUI now. In fact, I'm waking up at 5 a.m. every morning just to get that quiet time to practice. In one of these practice sessions, I decided to rebuild the 𝗧𝗺 game in SwiftUI, and I couldn't believe how easy it was. And for those of you who are new to my channel, this 𝗧𝗺 game is the starter app that I take all beginners through in order to get their feet wet in my How to Make an App video series that you can find right there. So in this video, I want to demonstrate for you how to build the 𝗧𝗺 game using SwiftUI. Stay tuned. Now before we get started, I need your feedback. In the video series that I mentioned earlier, that was designed for beginners with absolutely no coding experience. And so I go through every single little thing. Now here's my dilemma. I'm planning to release a new SwiftUI video series here on YouTube, and I need to decide whether I should design that series for people who have absolutely no coding background, which means that I'm going to explain every single little thing, and also that beginners can use this SwiftUI video series as their first foray and entry point into the iOS app development world. Or on the other hand, should I design that video series instead for people who have a baseline foundation knowledge, assuming that they've gone through my beginner series, that they've gone through some of my other material, and that will allow me to gloss over some of the basics and some of the details so we can move a little faster. Now I'm really hung up and stuck on this decision, so I would very much like your feedback. Please let me know down below. And on your way down there, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel and I really appreciate it. Now in this specific video though, I'm going to assume that you have gone through my beginner series and that you have that knowledge of Swift and Xcode, and that's where we're going to begin. That's the starting point for this specific 𝗧𝗺 game SwiftUI video. If it does happen that you're brand new to iOS and you're watching this, I would recommend that you go through my beginner series first. Links in the description, or maybe click the card in the upper left. And with that said, let's dive into SwiftUI 𝗧𝗺 game. So here we're going to start a brand new Xcode project. Now I'm using Xcode 11.2 with macOS Catalina. If you haven't upgraded your macOS to Catalina yet, don't worry. It's just that you're going to have to launch your app in the simulator to see the user interface that you've built. Whereas if you're on macOS Catalina or later, you're going to get a nice little preview pane beside your code that gives you a preview of what your user interface is going to look like. Now, if you want to work with SwiftUI, you need to at least have Xcode 11. So there's that. All right, if you're all set and ready to go, let's start this project. So we're going to choose iOS. We're going to choose single view app. I'm going to gloss over some of these details because we've set up so many projects before together. If you don't know what to fill in here, definitely check out my beginner series first. It'll explain what all of these things mean. Now I'm just going to type in 𝗧𝗺 game. How about SwiftUI 𝗧𝗺 game right here. And for the language, make sure it's set to Swift. For the user interface, make sure it's set to SwiftUI. The rest of it you can leave unchecked. So let's click next and let's save it anywhere you want. I'm going to save it on my desktop. Now one of the first things you'll notice is that we have something called a scene delegate now. And this is actually the app delegate responsibilities separated out into both an app delegate and a scene delegate. The reason for this is because now with iOS 13 there's multi-window support. The easiest way to think about this is on the iPad, where you can now have half your screen running one app and half the screen running another app, and they could actually be the same app. So those are multiple windows on, within the same app instance. And so that's why we have a scene delegate now that handles those windows, whereas the app delegate really handles the app's lifecycle events as a whole. Now the content view, this is your actual screen. What used to be a view controller with storyboard, your view being in the storyboard is now just a content view. And this has your logic where you would have placed in the view controller, as well as the code that generates or represents your user interface. So the first thing I want you to notice is that I have this preview pane here. If you don't see this, it's just a matter of clicking this button and toggling it on or off. Again, you have to be running at least macOS Catalina, or else you're going to get a little error message there that says you need to have that macOS. So anyways, if you hit resume now, you're going to see what this code represents on the right hand side. And I want you to notice something right off the bat, and that is that there is a content view which returns a view, and there's also a content view previews. So this code right here is the actual code that represents your user interface when you run your app. This part right here is just to generate what you see here in the preview. There is a distinction because this preview code isn't actually shipped in your live app. This is really just for development, and you can customize this in different ways. For example, to have to show your app within a different simulator or a different device, in a different landscape. You could separate out pieces of your user interface. So this preview code is really just to help you when you're developing the app, and it just generates what you see here. You can see here it's creating an instance of content view, which is this. So this line of code is what is putting what you see here on the right hand side. All right, so this code right here represents the actual user interface. So far we've just got a text element. So this is your first introduction. This is your first SwiftUI element. It's text, right? And inside you pass it a string, right? And that's going to display a label. Essentially, it's a UI label from UIKit. Now I'm going to show you another one, and this one is going to be image. And inside here we can specify an image asset name that we have. Unfortunately, right now we have nothing to see because we don't have any image assets. So why don't we do that first? We're going to go into the asset library, and in the description below you're going to see a link to download some images, specifically the war card game images that we're going to need. So I'm going to just copy all these images. You're going to have these same ones if you download those, and just drag it all into there. Now that is going to give us the back of the card, the background, cards 2 to 14, which is essentially 2 Jack, Queen, King, and Ace. We're going to have a deal button and a logo for the war card game. Now, if we go back to content view, we can put in a name here, such as logo. And there is a resume button here. If you're not seeing any changes on the preview, all you have to do is click resume. It's going to go ahead and compile that code that you have and generate a preview. Essentially, it's a simulator. It's running it in the background. You can do a live preview. That's this button right there. So if you click and enable that, this is going to make it so that as soon as you make a change, it's going to update there. All right, so that's our image. That's pretty exciting. Now, how do we add more elements to this screen? Well, you're just going to add your elements here, right? So I just showed you that text, right? So I'm going to say hello. Unfortunately, this errors out. Check this out. Like, we can't actually display the image and the text. And the reason for that is because if you take a look at this body property here, it's supposed to return a single view. It's some view, meaning that it could be, the type is not really known right now, but it has to be a single view object. And right here you got 2. So the way around this is that you have to use a layout container or a layout element. And there are a couple of pretty familiar ones if you're coming from UIKit. So one of them is called VStack. Now this basically combines elements and arranges it in a vertical manner. So you open up a pair of curly brackets, and any elements you place inside, it's just going to arrange them in a vertical fashion like we see here. Now check this out, there's no errors anymore, right? Because you are returning a single VStack view, right? So that satisfies this, but inside are actually multiple elements. So that's how you're going to have a user interface with more than one element. You're going to nest these different layout elements. Aside from the VStack, we also have HStack and ZStack. And yes, I said ZStack because I'm Canadian. I'm going to come right out and say that now. I'm not going to hide it any longer and say Z stack. So you guys are just gonna have to deal with that. Okay, so let me show you guys, before we add more layout containers and add more elements on here, I do want to show you guys one more thing, and that's called a modifier. So if you take a look, these two elements are right up against each other. What if I wanted to add some sort of padding? Let's say I wanted to maybe add 20 points in between these guys. And you know, I could either say that there is 20 points of padding below the image, or I can say there's 20 points of padding above the label or the text element. I'm gonna choose this one for now. So the way you add these modifiers, which essentially change that element in different ways, is just to call the appropriate modifier method on that element. So for instance, there is a padding modifier, which you can do on most elements, and you specify which edges you want in a set. So you could pass in an array of, let's say you wanted to add that 20-point padding to the right and the left, you would pass in a set and you would pass in right and left, or leading and trailing. For me, I just want to put the padding on the top right now, so I'm not going to specify a set, I'm just going to specify a single edge. And for the length, I'm going to put 20. Right? And you can see, boom, right there. So that is modifiers. And if you wanted to, let's say, change the text to a different color, you just chain it. You just call another method, and there is a foreground color, and let's just say I'm going to change it to red. Now, you don't need to know all of these modifiers by heart, because you can just put your cursor on the element here, and there is this drop down, add modifier, and you can see all of these different modifiers that you can add to that element. And also, once you start chaining more and more modifiers on an element, it gets kind of messy. And so a good way to organize these and make it very easy to read is just to hit enter before each modifier, and then it's going to create it in sort of like a list below the element, and it makes it really easy to read. All right, so I guess we gotta go back to live preview if we want that. All right, so now you've learned about the VStack, you've learned about, you know, modifiers. Why don't we start combining more elements? Let's show the two cards that are going to be randomized, and we want to show it below the logo. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this text element, and I am going to add the image, let's say card 2, or let's say back. And if I wanted to add another card, I would do that. But the problem is that they're one on top of each other, right? This is a VStack, so it's just going to arrange everything vertically. If we wanted to arrange these two side by side, we would use what's called an H stack. H stands for horizontal, and it works exactly like the VStack. We just open up a pair of curly brackets and we put these two image elements right inside like that. And it's going to arrange these two elements inside horizontally, and the VStack is going to arrange the logo and the H stack vertically on top of each other. And you guessed it, if we wanted a button here, we would go ahead and add that here. So before I show you the button element, I just want to go through a couple more things. So I'm just gonna put it as a label right now because I don't want to get into it just now. So we're going to change this into an actual button element in a second. All right, so now you know about H stack, you know about V stack. There is another one called Z stack, which I alluded to earlier, and this one arranges elements in front and behind of each other, like on top of each other, I guess you could call it. So if I wanted to put that green background behind everything, I would basically create a Z stack, and I would put an image here, and the image is going to be the background. And if I wanted to put something in front of that background image, I would basically put it inside the Z stack, but I would put it below that image. Now this background isn't showing up. I might have called it the wrong thing. Yeah, so this background has a capital B. That's why. So I could either do that, And then we're gonna see the green background, right there, with this V stack on top of the image. You see how that's happening with the Z stack? That's what that does. But I'm actually going to change this to a lowercase b and change this element. I'm just going to press enter. Oops, not there. I'm going to press enter and change it to a lowercase b so it's consistent with everything else. All right, so we've got that. And we need to add some modifiers to the image. The reason is because you see it's not reaching all the way up to the top. So which modifiers are we going to add? Well, the first one is I'm going to add one called resizable, which is going to basically allow this element to change sizes. And then I am going to add a second one called ignore safe area. And this area right beside the notch, that's considered not safe, because if you have things go into that area, it might get blocked by the notch. But I do want the background to go all the way up, so I'm going to tell it to ignore safe area on all edges. And I'm just going to choose all as the parameter there. So then you get that. Now again, to make it a little tidier, I'm just going to hit enter in front of these two, and so that it's very easy to read. Okay, so we've now got the background here. Now I want to show you something else. You can see that everything is kind of scrunched in the middle, right? And that's SwiftUI making assumptions on what we want. We didn't have to specify constraints to center anything or do anything like that. Right? SwiftUI is just making safe assumptions, but I kind of want there to be some spacing in between these elements. So there is an element called a spacer. And the way that a spacer works is that it takes up all the available space that is left. Let me show you how this works. So let's say I wanted to create some space in between the logo and the two cards. Here is the logo and here is the H stack containing the two cards. If I put a spacer element here, that's going to basically take up all the available space and push everything else apart. The cool thing is that I can put a spacer also below the deal button. And what's going to happen is that this spacer and this spacer are going to take up equal spaces. They're going to share the open space. Now I can put another spacer above the deal button below the two cards, like that. And essentially the three spacers that I've put are going to share the space. You can see how they're kind of have equal spacing. And if I wanted to, I could also put a spacer above the logo here. And that's going to add a little bit of space there as well. So that's really cool. Now we also have two labels. We have a bunch of labels in the left and right corner. If you've done the work hard game in my beginner lessons for UIKit, the UIKit version with the auto layout constraints and all that, you'll remember that we have some labels counting the score. So how do you think that we would add these labels to the bottom corners of the screen here? Well, what we could do is add an H stack. So why don't we go ahead and do that down here below the deal button. So there's our H stack, and what we're going to put are two text elements for the player score and the CPU score. So this player score, I actually want the player label to be above the 0. So I am going to wrap this up in a V stack, like that. Okay, so these, I'm going to get rid of that. So there's a little more space there, so it's easier to read. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this V stack because that contains my two labels. I'm going to add another V stack, but change this to CPU. And then we have that. But I want them spread apart, right? They should be in the two corners of the screen there. So I'm going to add a spacer in between these two V stacks. And that's going to push them apart. And I don't want them to be all the way down in the corner. So in this V stack, we have a spacer here, we have a spacer here, we have one here, we have one here, and I'm also going to add one below this H stack there. So see the spacer below this H stack is right there. That's going to split up the space evenly. So we have one there, one there, one there, one there, and one up here. All right. Also, these labels, this one is too close to the left edge. Let's add a 20-point margin to that. So here's the V stack. For that, I am going to add padding. And I'm going to say leading. And the length is 20. So we'll just hit enter on that. And then also, I want the font, the text in there to be white. So we can actually do that too. Foreground color, I'm going to choose white. And notice how I didn't do it to the individual text elements. I applied that to the entire V stack, and that affected both of the text elements inside. So that's really cool. All right, so now to work on this V stack, we're going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this actually, and we'll paste it right there. Except that this one's not leading. We're going to use trailing because it's the right edge, right? All right. And if we wanted to, we could just make this text a little bigger as well and a little bolder. So I am going to say that, I'm just going to bold that, or you could change the font weight. I'm also going to add padding to the bottom edge, and let's say that's going to be 20 as well. Okay, so that's just putting some space there. And do the same thing to the CPU. Like that. So, okay, so if we wanted to change the font size, we could add a modifier and change the font. I actually forget which exact one there is, but if we looked at the modifier list, you can probably find it. I'm not going to do this right now because fixed size, no font. Okay, you guys figure it out. You let me know in the comments below, okay? All right, now we're going to work on the button. Now we can finally get to the button because our layout looks pretty good now. It's pretty close to what we want. And everything, I hope everything's made sense so far. Pretty intuitive, right? You have your H stacks, your V stacks, your Z stacks, and you just have elements inside of those nested in there to kind of create this layout here. All right, so right here is our button element. Well, it's actually a label, but we're going to change it to a button. So let's erase this and let's call that a button. And we're going to create a new button element. And for buttons, it accepts two parameters, an action and a label. So the action is a block of code that you can pass in to be run when the button is tapped. And for the label, it's basically what you want to show for the button. So let's go ahead and click that, open, and I'm going to open up a closure for the action. Now this, we're going to just get to this in a second. As for the label, when you double click that, it actually opens up a trailing closure for you. And in here, you're gonna return an element which you want to use. So check this out. We can do that, and it's gonna be, looks like a standard iOS button. But instead of text, we can actually put an image in there. And we're gonna use our image asset deal button. The only problem is that you can see here, it's all blue. And that's because it's treating it like text, right? So the tint color is blue. But what we can do is we can add a modifier for the rendering mode, and we can pass in original. And that's actually going to show the full color graphic image like we want. So there's our deal button there. Now what do we want to happen when the deal button is tapped? Well, we want to randomize some parameters and basically show the images there. But how are we going to affect essentially how are we going to change this image inside this H stack? We need to change this to like card 2, or card 3, or whatever when this button is tapped on. Well, there's this concept called state properties inside SwiftUI. And so what we're gonna have happen is we're gonna tie this image to a state property, and we're gonna tie this one to another state property. And then when you click the deal button, we're just going to randomize and change the values of those state properties. And because these two images are kind of observing or looking at those two state properties, they are going to update themselves automatically when we change those the values in those state properties. It's kind of like magic. You're going to see it's really cool. So up here, let's declare a new state property, and this is how you declare it. You say that use the @ symbol and you write state, and then we're going to create a private variable, and I'm going to call this maybe random number 1. You're going to set that to, maybe I'll set that to 2 because 2 is the lowest card that we have. Let's see what this says here. Oops, sorry, I put it in the wrong place. It's actually supposed to be here inside the content view struct. My bad. Let's declare them up there, because this is inside the body property here. All right, so we're gonna declare that, and we're gonna declare another state property, which we're gonna call random number 2. And while we're at it, no, actually we'll do the score ones a little later. Let's just focus here on this first. All right, so rand1 and rand2, and we're gonna set them to 2 respectively. So in here, you know, instead of card 2, or what we're going to have is card, and then we're going to plus rand num1. That's an integer type though, so that's not going to really play nice. It's not going to automatically concatenate that. We're going to have to cast this integer to a string. So we're just going to declare a string and pass in the integer like that. You can see here, let's hit resume. You're going to see the 2 there. See, if I change this to a 3, or let's change it to a 4, and let's change this to a live preview, you're going to see that update to a 4. See? Cool. All right, and then for the right-hand side card, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to actually remove the number and make it depend on the rand num2 state property. You see 4 and 2, and if I change this to 5, and I hit resume, that's going to change to a 5. All right, so now all we need to do is when this button is tapped, we're going to randomize the integers, randomize the state properties. What is this typing? If you guys have a good mechanical keyboard recommendation, let me know in the comments below. I am looking for one. Okay, so actually we have to use self because we are referring to properties inside of a closure here. And so we're going to be specific and specify which one we want. We're going to use int random, and we are going to specify 2 to 14. That's what we had. And then we're also going to randomize the second state property. We're going to use the random function method again here. And for the range, we're going to again put 2 to 14. All right, and let's just launch this in the simulator and see what we have, because we can have some fun with it right now. And so you can see, this is essentially SwiftUI. Like, it's pretty intuitive in terms of building the user interface, and in terms of, you know, some pretty simple logic like this, it's pretty easy to hook up. All right, so when I'm hitting this deal button, it's basically randomizing and changing the values in these two state properties, and because the two image elements are depending on those state properties, they're updating themselves automatically. I don't have to explicitly tell the image to change, you know, it's just doing it. So that's really, really cool. Now we're gonna do the same concept, and we're going to apply it to the score, the updating of the score labels down here. So we're going to just create 2 more state properties. Let's just call this score 1 and score 2. And down here, instead of 0 for the text, we're going to pass in score self.score1. Actually, I don't think we need to do self there, because we're not working inside of a closure. And we are going to also do score 2. Score 2. Make sure it's score 2, otherwise you're going to get some weird logic errors. So this is reading from score 1 state property, and this one's reading from score 2, or observing it. And we are going to have to update those 2 numbers. All right, so in here, it's a simple if statement. Update scores. So we're going to say if self.randnum1 is greater than self.randnum2, then we are going to say score 1 plus equals 1, which is just going to increment it by 1. Else if self.randnum2 is greater than self.randnum1, then we're going to have score 2 plus equals 1. So that's going to increment the second score 2. Oops. Self there. And that's it. Let's run it. This is the word card game, guys. We are done. That's so easy. I felt like it was really easy when I used this as a practice. It was like, wow, are you serious? I think teaching this to beginners is going to be a lot of fun, because when we did the UI kit version, I had to explain auto layout constraints, and then a lot of people would apply them wrong, and then they wouldn't get the same layout, and it was very frustrating. I'm sure a lot of people just got frustrated and gave up and didn't even try to ask for help and figure it out. The other thing is that in the UI kit version, you had to connect all of these 𝗂𝗏𝗃 properties to the elements on the storyboard, and a lot of people would misconnect them, and it would just crash their app, and they would go down this rabbit hole of trying to figure that out, and I'm sure a lot of people just gave up too. So I think this is going to be a lot easier for beginners to pick up, and that's always good, right? Frustration early on is sometimes the killer of what could be a future amazing developer, a whole new career, or a very successful app. But that early frustration, is dangerous. It can kill a lot of the hopes and dreams. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this SwiftUI demo for the word card game. So what do you think? When I compare the UI kit storyboard version that I built in my original video series versus this SwiftUI version, I think this SwiftUI version actually has more lines of code, but it is actually easier and faster to build, because unlike the UI kit storyboard version, I'm not dragging and dropping elements onto the storyboard, configuring auto layout constraints, and then connecting IB outlet properties and IB action methods, and so we save a lot of time that way. Furthermore, with doing all of that stuff, with the UI kit storyboard version, there's a lot of opportunities to make mistakes, such as connecting the wrong element, making a typo when you're connecting those IB outlet properties, misconfiguring auto layout constraints, and stuff like that. I feel really good about the future of SwiftUI, and it reaffirms my belief that with SwiftUI, it's going to be even easier for beginners to get into the world of iOS app development. With that said, thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to hit that thumbs up button. Thanks again, I'll see you in the next lesson.